good afternoon, and welcome from me. First, a little apology. I heard there was a little bit of a sandwich crisis downstairs. For those who did not get any sandwich, please be informed. There will be some more after the seminar downstairs in the kitchen. So just that you do not have too many negative feelings in our seminar today. Thank you all for joining us today, either here at SEPS or online via our live stream. I would like to welcome all of you to the next edition of our MEDAM seminar in the year 2019. MEDAM is the Mercator Dialogue on Asylum and Migration. The project constitutes a research alliance of SEPS, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, and the Migration Policy Center in Florence, and is funded by Stiftung Mercator. I'm Andreas Backhaus. I'm a research fellow here at SEPS and a member of the MEDAM project. Today we will discuss the question, what is Islamophobia? The opinions of European citizens about Muslim immigrants have important implications for some of the most pressing challenges facing Western democracies. However, our contemporary understanding of the term Islamophobia is still very limited. Is it a dislike based on immigrants' ethnic background, or is it rather their religious identity that causes rejection? Or is it more an aversion toward specific religious behaviors and currents of Islam? Professor Mark Helbing is joining us today in order to provide insights from his research on the matter. His recent paper, What is Islamophobia? Disentangling Citizens' Feelings Towards Ethnicity, Religion, and Religiosity using a Survey Experiment, which will form the core of today's talk, has been published in the British Journal of Political Science and has won the Best Paper Award by the Immigration Research Network of the Council for European Studies. Mark Helbing is a full professor in political sociology at the Department of Political Science at the University of Bamberg and a research fellow at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center, where he has previously been head of the research group Immigration Policies in Comparison. Among his works, he has edited the volume Islamophobia in the West, Measuring and Explaining Individual Attitudes. For the next half an hour, Mark will delight us with the presentation of his findings, and I will follow up with a brief discussion, and then we'll have plenty of time to broaden the discussion into the next room and take your questions. Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this invitation. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as you see, the title of my paper is What is Islamophobia? The question, what is specific about Islamophobia? What do we really mean when we talk about Islamophobia? So the point of departure of this research project are pictures and newspaper headlines like these that all of a sudden, or I mean, at least for a couple of years now, I've been talking about how Islam, Muslim immigration poses a threat to Christianity, which is in a way a little bit surprising to see and to hear in a secular society, that people all of a sudden seem to be concerned about Christian values or the disappearance of Christianity and the threat to Christianity. This is then not only a talk about or research project about attitudes towards Muslims, Muslim immigrants, but also the question of how Islam is perceived as a threat to Christianity, and to what extent people also dislike or resent people from other religious groups. So we talk about Islamophobia all the time. That's a term that's widely used in research and media and public debates. At first, it seems pretty straightforward, pretty clear what we mean by that. But once we start thinking about it, discussing it, then it's maybe not that clear, and we might have different understandings. And that's why we ask this question: what is actually Islamophobia? Because we think it's not that straightforward or that clear all the time, or each time we use that term or that concept. So, literally it means a fear of Islam. So it could mean that people are Islamophobic because they don't like the religion of Islam, or resent or oppose the religion of Islam. But it might also be just, a resentment towards people that are foreigners, that are immigrants, that have a different ethnicity, different nationality, that look different. And in that sense, it might be that Islamophobia is nothing else than a synonym for xenophobia. And that's actually also part of my other research. I've been working on this, and other people have been working on this, to what extent we can actually differentiate between Islamophobia and xenophobia. And maybe it's the same as xenophobia, but since large part of immigrants in Western Europe nowadays constitute Muslim immigrants, we use the term Islamophobia. Or it could also mean, more specifically, the fear of religiosity. So it's not so much, the religion or the fact that those people are immigrants, but the fact maybe that they are more religious. Display of religious symbols is, as we all know, and often leads to a lot of controversy, like the headscarf, for example, or the construction of mosques and minarets. So there are different aspects. So Muslim immigrants are different from natives in Western Europe regarding their nationality or ethnicity, if you like, their religion, but also often their religiosity, because on average they are more religious than natives or Christian natives in Western Europe. So all of these parts could play a certain role, maybe several of them. Some maybe are more important than others when it comes to negative attitudes towards immigrants from Muslim countries. So the question here is the question we ask: which of these three aspects or elements matters most, or maybe they're equally important? But we think that they should at least be disentangled to see whether they all matter or not. And to do this, before I continue with our main arguments and the theoretical aspects of this research, I'd like to jump to the research design of this project to illustrate how we try to disentangle these three aspects. So what we did is, in a survey in Great Britain, and I will provide some more details later on, we conducted a survey experiment where we confronted participants in Great Britain with different descriptions of immigrants. And we varied the description of the immigrants to see how they react to different descriptions of an immigrant. And we varied the descriptions along 3 dimensions, and exactly along the 3 dimensions I just outlined that could actually constitute or lead to Islamophobic attitudes. So first, we differentiate between different nationalities. So we took Great Britain, or British nationals as some kind of a reference category, as the native point of reference. Then we took 2 immigration groups from Nigeria and Bulgaria, and we took those 2 because in these countries we actually do have both Muslim and Christian persons, that potentially, or not only potential, but indeed to migrate to Great Britain. So Nigeria is an important immigration group in Great Britain, and more recently, immigrants from Bulgaria have also become more important in Great Britain. And so in Bulgaria, there are about 10% of the population is Muslim. In Nigeria, I think it's around 40%. And this also allows us to differentiate between a European immigration group and a non-European immigration group. We didn't find any differences between those groups, so I can already rule out, and as you will see later on the results, we do not differentiate anymore between these different migration groups from Nigeria and Bulgaria because the findings are exactly the same. We can come back to this in the discussion. But at least it allows us to differentiate between different nationalities, and then within those groups, we differentiate between Muslim and Christian immigrants to see how attitudes vary towards immigrants that have a Muslim or a Christian background. So this is something other people have already looked at. That is not new to do this kind of experiment where we differentiate between Muslims and Christians from different nationalities. What is now new in this particular project is that we also differentiate between different degrees of religiosity. So we have vignettes or descriptions of immigrants that are non-religious at all, devout, or radical. What do we mean by that? So non-religious people, according to our definition, are people who never go to the church or the mosque, depending on whether they are Muslims or Christians, and never pray. Devout people are those who regularly go to church and mosque and regularly pray, and radicals are those who think or agree with the statement that there's only one interpretation of the Bible or the Quran, and the Bible or Quran are more important than secular laws. So it is based on existing research on fundamentalism, radicalism. That's how those are not our definitions. Those are definitions that are used in the sociology of religion. So we took these definitions, and that's how we described these immigrants in the vignettes, to make sure that the people that participate in the survey have the same understanding as ours, that we are on the same page when it comes to these different descriptions. But I will come back and give you some examples on how we did the survey later on. So this is just to show you how we differentiate these different dimensions and what you understand by religiosity, religion, and nationality. So in the end, this is also then a paper about attitudes between non-religious people and religious people. So it's not only, and that's maybe a new aspect to this research, that we also like to know more specifically how people react towards other people that are more religious than themselves, and not necessarily Muslims, but also Christians. And there's surprisingly little research on this particular topic. So we actually almost didn't find any research at all. That is survey-based research. There's some research, of course, in the field of Islamophobia that somehow always deals with this particular question of how do people react towards other people that are more or less religious. But since the existing research does not really allow to differentiate between these different dimensions, we never really know when people indicate negative feelings towards Muslim immigrants, we never know, is it because they're immigrants, is it because they're more religious, or anything like that. So this is somehow part of that research, but empirically it's not really possible to differentiate those aspects so far. That's why we did this new survey. There's some research in the US on attitudes towards different, more or less religious groups. There's some research on atheists. That is also interesting for our research because it shows that this is a group that is resented most by US Americans among all kinds of minorities you can think of. So there are these also surveys that ask participants to indicate their attitudes towards all kinds of minorities, and they have lists of 10, 15 minorities, be it homosexuals, immigrants, Muslims, unemployed people, whatever you can think of, and those people are always resented the most among all kinds of minorities. And so that's one kind of research, one strand of research that exists in the US. Another strand of research, also actually interesting for us, is research on Christian fundamentalists. And what is interesting, a finding that is often discussed in this literature is that it's especially those people who are normally quite tolerant towards minorities actually show quite negative feelings towards this particular group. And those are academics, left-wing liberals. So that's similar to some of our findings, as you will see later on, that those people are resented most by those people who actually normally are quite tolerant towards all other minorities that exist. So that's just to give you some overview of the little research we have so far when it comes to this particular question or specific question on attitudes towards religious minorities. So now, besides disentangling those different aspects of Islamophobia, we're also interested in explaining negative attitudes towards Muslim immigrants to see which particular groups of natives resent those people. And of course, there are different theories, different explanations that already exist in the literature on xenophobia. And here we try to develop some additional arguments that might be particularly important in the field of Islamophobia. And we are interested in three aspects: religiosity of the natives, liberal values, and state-church relationship. Now, in this paper, we only focus on the first two, religiosity and liberal values, and there's other research we did in the past where we focus more particularly on state-church relationships and how this actually also plays a role in understanding attitudes towards Muslim immigrants. But since we focus on one country only in this research and on individuals only, we only focus on individual factors now. So the question is, to what extent does religiosity of the natives, so Christian natives, help us understand negative attitudes towards Muslim immigrants? So we know that religious people are more conservative on average. If you understand, we define here religiosity in a very traditional way. So people who often go to church, for example, often pray. There are different forms of religiosity, but here we have this specific understanding of a very traditional form of religiosity. Those people are more conservative on values, as we know from other research, and more conservative people are also more xenophobic, have more prejudices against immigrants. So you would expect that more religious people, especially those people who are more religious, that also have a problem with Muslim immigrants. Also, and that's a related argument, because they might perceive another religious group as a threat to their own religion. It's like, xenophobia, nationalism. You perceive immigrants as a threat to your nation. That's why more nationalist people are more xenophobic. And you could make a similar argument about religious groups, that the more religious you are, the more you perceive another religious group as a threat. So that would mean that more religious people should show more negative attitudes towards Muslim immigrants. But in the literature in general, there's also a counter-argument that is often discussed, namely that religious people might show more tolerance, especially towards minorities, because religious values in general are also about, welcoming other people, be open, helping other people, helping people in need. So that could actually then lead to more tolerance among religious people, because they have those religious people, they show themselves more open, more tolerant towards other minorities. There's also research, or at least in the literature, it's discussed. It's not really empirically proven, or we do not have a strong empirical basis, but at least another argument that is often discussed is that those people who are religious might actually show some solidarity with other religious people. Why is this so? Because most religious people in Western societies are themselves a minority in a secular society. So they might actually, know what it means to be in a minority in the secular society. And we know from other research, more in the classical migration research field, that minorities often, feel closer to other minorities or show some solidarity towards other minorities. So this could actually then lead to a similar situation in this particular field, where the religious minorities among Christians in a Christian society shows themselves more open, also because they know what it means to be religious, and etc. So we have two counter-arguments here. So one that could then lead to more negative attitudes among religious natives, or more tolerance. And in the end, then it's simply an empirical question to see which of these two arguments hold. About liberal values, that's another aspect we are interested in to explain, to understand attitudes towards Muslim minorities. And here as well, we developed two different counter-arguments that could lead to more positive or more negative attitudes. In general, we know liberals are more tolerant. They are more open towards minorities, so we should see that, or actually observe more positive attitudes when it comes to Muslim immigrants. Now, it depends, of course, what you understand by liberal values and what liberalism really means. So it can be, a general openness towards, basically, liberalism can mean be open, be tolerant towards everything else that is different from yourself. But what happens when it comes to groups, people, aspects that are at least allegedly not liberal and do not share these liberal values? Do liberals then still show themselves open towards those groups? So might we rather speak of a liberal openness in the sense that you are only tolerant towards other things, other people, other groups, as long as they at least share some of the basic values of liberalism. Whether this is now true or wrong, or whether Muslims do this or not, is of course a completely different question. It's all about perception of how these people are perceived, how this group is perceived. And if you perceive them as illiberal, might that lead then to more negative attitudes towards among liberals? So again, then this would be the counter argument that would lead to more negative attitudes towards Muslim immigrants. So to test these arguments, we did an online survey in Great Britain in 2015 with a relatively large sample. In the meantime, we also replicated at least part of the study in other Western European countries. We are not yet done. We still have to write up those findings, but we have more or less found the same patterns. So what I show you today is only the findings from Great Britain, but there was no particular reason why we did it in Great Britain. We just had the opportunity to do this survey there, but we could also have done it in any other Western European country. And so I already mentioned this before. So the core aspect of the study is vignettes like these here. So that's what we presented to the participants in the survey, a short description of a potential immigrant coming to Great Britain. What we did then is we varied randomly the description of those three key aspects of this person. So first, the ethnicity or the nationality, So it's either somebody from Great Britain or somebody from Nigeria or Bulgaria. Then it's a Muslim or Christian person. And then it's a person who is more or less religious, non-religious, devout, or radical. And as I said before, we always provided the definition of what we mean by the degree of religiosity, because people might have very different understandings when we talk about radical Muslims. People might have different understandings of what that actually is. So we provided the definition, and you might agree or disagree with that definition, but at least we make sure that everybody's on the same page and has the same understanding, and we know what it actually means when they express their attitudes on the basis of what description they express this particular attitude. And then we used a very classic thermometer question that is often used in that kind of survey, where we ask people to indicate their feelings from very cold to very warm on this scale from 0 to 100. So low values towards 0 mean negative attitudes or cold feelings, and higher values mean more positive or more favorable attitudes towards the different groups of people that were described on the vignette. Okay, findings. So this is just a descriptive overview of the main findings. So this is at the bottom you have the scale that I described before that goes from 0 to 100. So 0 means negative attitudes, 100 means positive attitudes. And then, so you see here for each group we defined beforehand, you see the average attitudes towards those groups. So first, we differentiate between non-practicing, devout, and radical people. Then within each group, we then differentiate between whether they are natives or immigrants. So if attitudes are expressed towards Muslims that live in Great Britain or have a British nationality or not, or whether they constitute immigrants. And as I said before, immigrants means both people from Bulgaria and Nigeria. And then again, then within those groups, we differentiate between Christians and Muslims. So the white dot is the average attitudes towards Christians, and the full dot or the black dot are the Muslims. And so first you see that, for example, natives are on average perceived more positively than immigrants. That's something I think everybody would expect. And you also see that for most groups, there's one or two, there's actually one exception, that also Christians are seen more positively than Muslims. So Christian, the white dot is always to the right of the black dot, so they are seen more positively than Muslims. That's also something we already know. But then when we look more particularly at the degree of religiosity, we also see some interesting patterns. So we see, first of all, something that a little bit surprised us, that devout immigrants or devout people in general are not seen more negatively than non-religious people. And this might be, so we can maybe discuss this later on, but if we relate this to the US research I mentioned before, that atheists, that is of course different from non-religious people, but that a lot of people also have problems or negative attitudes towards that particular group of people, that on average then the non-practicing, non-religious people are maybe not seen more positively even in a secular society compared to the devout people, which in this case are people who just regularly go to church or the mosque. But when it comes to radicals, then we see that this group is clearly seen as the most negative one among all the groups. And this is true for both Christians and Muslims. So here we see also that people in general have a big problem with radicals or fundamentalists, and even more so than other immigrant groups. So if you take, for example, the native Christians, or among the radicals, the native Christians, for example, they are seen way more negative than, for example, devout Muslim immigrants. So people do not have, on average, very negative attitudes towards Muslim immigrants and positive attitudes towards Christian natives. It really also depends on the degree of religiosity, and then some natives or some Christians are seen more negatively than some Muslim immigrants. So those are the main findings when we just look at the average attitudes towards those different groups. And you also see from a methodological perspective that it's really important or worthwhile to differentiate between all these different dimensions because it shows us that people clearly make a difference between all these groups. It could also be, we didn't know before that, but it could have been that people do not really make a difference between different kinds of Muslim immigrants, but they see them all, as the same Muslims or more or less religious people. And then for each group, we created a scale of liberal values. So we created 2 scales just to see how robust our findings are and to see whether it actually depends on the specific scale we use. But as you see, it doesn't really make a difference. So the left-right ideology is a classic question that is often used in surveys that just asks people to place themselves on a scale from 1 to 10, whether they are right-wing or left-wing, politically speaking. And then the cultural liberalism is a scale based on different questions on attitudes towards gender issues, attitudes towards homosexuals, etc. Classic questions that are often used in surveys to measure liberal values or conservative values. But it doesn't really make a difference whether we used one or the other scale. What you see here regarding, and then we also always differentiate between liberals and conservatives. So the full black dot is the left-wing participants in the survey, and the white one are the right-wing or conservative participants. And you see for immigrants and Muslims, when you ask people about attitudes with immigrants and Muslims, you see that the left-wing liberals are more open towards those groups than conservative right-wing people, something we already know from other research. But then what is interesting is that when it comes to different degrees of religiosity, devout people or fundamentalist radicals, you see the inverse pattern. You see there that actually the conservatives are more open towards those groups than the left-wing participants in the survey. You can see that when it comes to radicals, they're clearly seen most negative among all the groups, so nobody likes them, of course. But you see that the liberals actually dislike or resent them even more than the conservatives. And the conservatives are slightly more open, on average still way more negative than compared to all the other groups. So no doubt about that. But we see that, again, there's some differentiation between liberals and conservatives, and the pattern is very different depending on which minorities we take. And again, relating this back to the only research we have so far on attitudes towards Christian fundamentalists in the US, we also see that when it comes to those religious groups, it's not the natives of the participants in the survey plays a role. Here again, we see for the same scale, when it comes to immigrants and Muslims, we differentiate between different degrees of religiosity of the participants of the survey, so whether they are practicing devout or radical, and we use the same definitions as we used to create the survey, the experiment or the vignettes I showed you before. And you see that there's not really a big difference when it comes to immigrants and Muslims. Immigrants, I would say there's some tendency that more religious people are slightly more open, but it's not statistically significant. But there's at least a tendency towards that. When it comes to Muslims, there's a rather inverse tendency, but actually overall there's no big difference between these different groups. Where it gets more interesting is when it comes to devout and radical persons or minorities. There we see that religiosity of the participants clearly plays an important role. And the more religious you are yourself, the more open you are towards those other groups that are more religious. Again, we see a clear tendency towards negative attitudes among radicals, but among those people, we see that the more religious you are yourself, or let's say the less religious you are, the more you resent radical immigrants. So we do see that religiosity does play a role, but only when it comes to religious minorities. So to conclude, I think more or less my time is probably up. To conclude, we can summarize that. So that what we know from all the research, but we have now also shown it here for Muslim immigrants and particularly also religious minorities, that out-group hostilities depend on in-group identity. So the way you define yourself, that's how you also see other minorities. And so the more religious you see yourself, for example, the more open you are also towards other religious groups. And the more liberal you are, the more hostile you are towards religious groups, for example. And then this also actually shows us that to understand Islamophobia, we not only need to disentangle these different aspects, we also need to understand that there are different groups who resent or Muslim groups, depending on how you describe those Muslim groups, and that not only conservative right-wing people might have negative attitudes, but also liberal left-wing persons might have some negative attitudes, depending on on the specific groups we talk about. And then, that leads to the conclusion that there's not just this one Muslim group, but there are, of course, as we all know, different kinds of Muslim groups that are more or less religious and coming from different countries. And apparently, as we show now here for the first time, actually, it really matters how you describe Muslim immigrants or how they are perceived, how they are seen, and this has an impact on how positive or negative attitudes are towards Muslims, and that we actually need to differentiate between these different dimensions to understand what Islamophobia actually is. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, thanks again for your presentation. So the first question that came basically to my mind when I read your paper and when I saw this question, which was basically what actually do people in the West not like about Muslim immigrants? I was wondering, why has nobody earlier looked into that? Why has nobody collected evidence to the degree or to the differentiation that you have? Without going conspiratorial, but maybe has there been some reluctance to look into this term Islamophobia because it's so charged that academics might have had some aversion to look into it. And of course, some academics also use the term quite generously themselves. So what has been maybe your experience there?
I don't think, I'm not sure whether people are reluctant to do research on this. There's now, a growing community, research community in this field. But the general answer is, first of all, that migration research in general is underdeveloped. There's not as much research as one might expect actually in this field. So I would say it's still a rather young field. It's clearly a growing field, so more people are working on this. So that's probably one part of the answer. And the second part, especially when it comes to survey research, we had to conduct this ourselves. So if you look at existing surveys, social science surveys, especially international surveys, there's very few questions in these surveys that could be used for research on migration, on xenophobia. There's maybe one or two questions sometimes. Especially when it comes to this particular aspect of Islamophobia, there's maybe one question in there, what is your attitude towards Muslim immigrants, something like that. And that's, of course, useful to have. But as I've shown and as we argued, I think we need to really to differentiate this. And then, so it's an underdeveloped field, and we do not have yet the resources to study this in more detail. And I think that's probably the main explanation. Yeah.
One question that came up, for example, with the last slide where you say there is not one category, Muslims, 3 dimensions, nationality, religion, religiosity. I would find it very interesting to look more deeply into how do your survey respondents, of course now the survey is done, but maybe if you do another one, how do they actually perceive Muslims in their country? Do they actually have these different classifications of Muslims in their mind and perception? Or do they say, or do they think, well, I just don't like the fundamentalist Muslims, but I think 90% of Muslims are fundamentalists. So then, it's just a change of terms, and it would not imply such a differentiated view if you just have a very single dimension perception of Muslims and immigrants.
Right. So this is clearly only the first step in this direction. So we need much more research, and it would clearly be very useful to have also more qualitative data that that would actually provide some, that would actually ask people, about their perceptions, and that we could better understand it. There's some research, I think most of it in the US, that actually does show that often people confuse these categories, and when they hear Muslim, they hear almost radical and terrorist and something like that. So that's often something that pops up. There's some research that shows that, but not a lot. So I think that we clearly need more data on this. But actually, I think our study already shows that to some extent people do differentiate between these different categories, because if they didn't, I think we wouldn't find those large differences. Because even if you tell people, well, there's a Muslim immigrant who never goes to church, never goes to the mosque. You might still think if the only thing that comes to your mind is terrorism when you hear Muslim, then probably this would be so strong that even there you would see more negative attitudes. But the fact that actually people do differentiate and then move to a more positive position might constitute or provide some hints that actually that people in general, that on average, maybe if you just ask about Muslims, attitudes are so negative in general, as shown in other surveys, other projects. That's because people, mix up those categories. But once you allow them actually to disentangle these categories and to differentiate between these categories, I think that leads then to more detailed, more specific answers and positions, I would say. But again, coming back to, I would say we clearly need more research on this.
Yeah, and the question related in this direction would be interesting to find out how does this differentiation of Islamophobia translate into political support for different immigration policies. So would a group like the liberals, who are very opposed to fundamentalist Islam, which kind of immigration policies or integration policies would they support? Would they support legal crackdown on fundamentalist mosque, for example? Would they support screening of immigrants for fundamentalist attitudes? So there is some transmission mechanism from attitudes to support for political action. Would also be quite interesting to see if there's a divergence or if people basically stick to what they think.
Sure. So the next, that actually we just about to start a project on attitudes towards different migration policies, and that's basically somehow tackles this particular question on what kind of policies people prefer. But my expectation will clearly be based on these findings that there's a large group of people that has problems with religious values in general or religiosity that would expect immigrants to integrate regarding liberal culture and only support policies or immigrant groups as long as they clearly support or agree with certain basic liberal values. I mean that's the debate we already have, and that's a debate we already observe for such a long time, and that's somehow reflected in these findings here. That this clearly reflects those negative attitudes people have with religious values in general or religiosity.
One result that we saw was basically this, I don't want to say opposition or contradiction, but basically on the left we saw, on left-leaning people, liberal-leaning people, we saw in general they have warm feelings towards immigrants as a group, but then on the other scale they have very negative feelings towards fundamentalists. Still, that's my perception, maybe I'm biased or whatever, but the accusation of Islamophobia in political debate, to me it seems is mostly raised from the left liberal side. So I cannot recall a conservative or right-wing politician accusing someone of Islamophobia from the left. How would you explain this pattern that in the public debate Islamophobia as a term is basically so weaponized on a one-sided spectrum?
Well, that's maybe related to one of the other questions I'm interested in that is somehow also treated in this paper, but more so in other papers I've wrote in the past, is what is the difference between Islamophobia and xenophobia? And for some people, this is more or less the same. So it's just negative attitudes towards immigrants, and we do not really make a difference, or in public debate is not often made. And we speak of Islamophobia because, as I said before, it just happens to be the most important, or at least the most controversial immigration group nowadays, and that's why we use this term. But people have more or less the same understanding, and that's why, and because traditionally, at least, it's mostly the political right that opposes immigration or has a problem with immigrants. That this is the big differentiation we actually make in public debates or even in academia. So we do not really. And there's some other research. I mean, we are not the first one who look at this, negative attitudes among liberals towards immigrants. So there's also some U.S. research that shows that under certain circumstances, left-wing people might be as prejudiced as conservatives, And sometimes they're just better at hiding. So there's some experiments in the US that actually shows that are a little bit better at hiding their negative attitudes towards immigrants. Because, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and all these attitudes is also a lot about, political correctness and the way certain people behave in debates, and that's how they appear differently.
So I looked up some recent findings by Pew, PEW research from 2018, who was surveying global societies. As you might know this research. And they found Europeans, many Western European societies who are already very secular, said, well, in the last 10 years, we have seen religion becoming more important again in our societies. And at the same time, in these countries, there was a strong opposition to an increased role of religion. So do you see that this maybe a backlash against immigration of religious people could also be fueled by this feeling our public debate is becoming centered more about the issue of religion again, and basically we thought already we were done with that. So it was like a private thing, and now it actually has come back like full speed into the public sphere.
Well, it clearly did, because there's now this new group of people that are on average more religious, and they want to practice their religion. So Western societies have to deal not only with immigrants, but also with the fact that this religion plays a certain role for certain people. And apparently, or clearly, some people don't like that. So this will lead to new conflicts. Or at least controversial debates. And that's somehow also my interest in this. So this is now coming from my migration research. But another interesting related aspect is clearly the attitudes towards religious people more generally, something I'd like to pursue in the future. And as I said before, surprisingly, actually, at least to me, is we don't know anything about that. How non-religious people see religious people, irrespective of their ethnicity or immigration status. So nobody has done any research on this, at least from a quantitative survey perspective. Some research in the US, but that is clearly a field that, because we have been living for a long time, or still live in a very secular society, so that maybe it really hasn't been seen as a big issue, but it clearly becomes a more important issue nowadays. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Now we would like to open the floor to you and to your questions. We would pass around a microphone. It's quite important that you speak into it and switch it on, because then the people on the internet can hear you too. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand.
Yes, the question is here, what is Islamophobia? My question would be rather, why Islamophobia? Why do we use this term, Islamophobia? I've never heard when somebody criticized the Pope was accused of Catholicophobia or something like this. Islam is like Christianity, a world religion with all races. And I think, if I'm not wrong, Khomeini coined the term of Islamophobia to protect Islam against criticism. And if I, for example, would criticize Pierre Vogel, who is ethnic German but a radical Salafist, and criticize his Islamic attitude, he would immediately accuse me of Islamophobia, because he knows exactly that this term is associated with xenophobia. So I think this term is completely wrong and we should abandon it. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on our findings. We could also. So I think when I started this research, or the first version of this paper had the title "Anti-Religious Sentiments" and something, but I used the term "anti-religious sentiments," and for several reasons, also discussions made my course, and we ended up with this title. But this just to show you that actually this is I'm still thinking about this, or we thought about this, and somehow this is also one of the basic questions of this paper is why we use that term, because if it turns out that actually it's not very different from xenophobia, then we don't use the term we don't need that term anymore. We already have a term like xenophobia. If it turns out that people have a particular problem with Islam, or Muslim religious people, then that might be the appropriate term to describe this particular phenomenon. But this is clearly, at least for me, it's still an open question. I mean, we still use that term partly for practical reasons, because that's a term is widely used and everybody knows that term. And most of the literature uses that term. There is some literature, but in the beginning, when this field started to become more important, some people use terms like anti-Muslim sentiments or anti-Muslim racism, things like that, because they wanted to differentiate between the group of immigrants that are from Muslim countries and the religion itself, because Islamophobia is, means fear of Islam. So that's rarely what we actually mean, what anybody means. So there's some alternatives, but this is clearly the dominant term, but something we need to question, as you're saying.
And also, I think you pointed out also, or you mentioned it in the beginning of the paper, Islamophobia, also in the scientific context, is even defined as an irrational fear. So it's not even excluded that it's based on any rational concerns about, for example, fundamentalist positions gaining more ground in societies. I agree, of course, nobody would call making fun of the Pope irrational or something like that. Maybe one thing, why is this, I think your question was, why is it so frequently used, this term, could of course be if somebody like Pierre Vogel, or from the radical Salafist context, uses the term Islamophobia or says he is being attacked as from Islamophobes, there might be some tendency maybe on the liberal side to come to the protection of people who they see on a kind of racist, prejudiced, attacked, and might neglect maybe looking into, are these actually secular or just devout people, or are these fundamentalists under attack who are trying to shield themselves by using this term?
Yes, I have a question concerning the categories left liberal on the one hand and right conservative on the other hand. Left and liberal. We are here in Belgium with a liberal prime minister who is a right-wing person, the same in the Netherlands with a liberal prime minister. And then the left towards the religion, when the left is, for example, socialist, they were, I think, traditionally opposed to any religious affiliation. They have always fought against this. When you look at Germany, the left party there is in the tradition of the governing party in the German Democratic Republic, who have clearly discriminated Christians. They have prevented them from having a university degree and so on. So I don't see this link between left and liberal. And I think that the left, this socialist left, wasn't it anti-religious because they have linked religious affiliations always with stupidity. That people are stupid when they would really think, they would realize that there is no God. And therefore you have also to prevent them for getting a university degree. So, and I think, yes, they are, at least in Germany, I think, open also to Islam, but sometimes I have the impression that they think now the religion in the form of Islam presents itself in such a negative way that then people will again not stay stupid anymore, but be so intelligent as we are and see that there should be no religion.
Okay, so that's many aspects we could talk hours about it. So and a very important aspect. So maybe just go to this one slide. So here we are only interested in like individual level aspects, individual characteristics, and how these individual characteristics help us understand attitudes towards Muslim immigrants. So I just show this slide because there's also this third aspect, state-church relationship, that is also very interesting, actually. I didn't treat this now in this paper. We have another paper on this that actually shows that state-church relationship, so the traditional role the church plays in the state, where there's closer connection, closer links between the state and church or not, actually also helps us understand attitudes towards Muslim immigrants. So that's just to show, and you're of course completely correct, that the political cultural context plays an important role on what is understood by religion, what is understood by left and right, and all these things mean slightly different meanings in different countries. So that this also plays an important role. That was just not a topic here, and I couldn't go into the details. And then, of course, the other question is, what we understand by liberalism, what we understand by left, right, and that's actually the reason why we have these two scales is because sometimes it's not, you're not completely sure how reliable these scales really are and what they actually mean and what people understand by this. So the left-right is, as I said before, a simple question that asks people to position themselves on a scale from 1 to 10 or 1 to 7, how right or how left you are. That's a very typical question used in the surveys that everybody uses and everybody criticizes at the same time for the reasons you mentioned. Is, what does that really mean, left and right? What does it mean in different countries? What does it mean if I tick 1 or 2? Is this radical left or just normal left or moderate left? So all these things are very problematic, and that's why we came up with this. We used a second scale that is part of that survey that measures cultural liberalism, so those questions on attitudes towards homosexuals, gender equality, and things like that, to see actually whether it actually matters. And here we see it doesn't matter. So this seems to measure pretty much the same thing, left-right scale, and those. And that's exactly why we did this, because it might be that people have very different understandings. Now again, so this is the findings of one country, Great Britain. It might be that, of course, the average positions are different in different countries. So it's clearly more complicated than what we show here. Yeah.
And to your point, I think criticism that some on the left would raise against other parts of the left is that maybe this clear fixation on secularism and anti-religiosity has been a bit lost, maybe. So if you think of Ilhan Omar, who is a member of the US Congress, who wears a headscarf and who has actually taken the oath on the Quran, if I'm not mistaken, has made some questionable statements on Jews and the Muslim Brotherhood, and she's a member of the Democratic Party, so of the left-leaning socialist, kind of social democratic party of the US. Which can be just a surprising thing to notice without any judgment.
Hi, 2 quick questions. I guess the survey is done, I understand that, but I wonder if you would expect any difference if you had also considered the gender dimension on those nationality, religion, and religiosity. That's one. And the second, the 2 countries that you used as origin countries of immigrants, Nigeria and Bulgaria. I mean, to be politically correct, immigrants from these countries do not look really similar. So I don't know if you, like the skin difference, for example, maybe if you changed with another country, do you think it will change the results of the attitudes or not?
Regarding skin color?
Because you chose origin countries which, I mean, people from those countries look a bit different. So I just wonder whether that would make any difference. If you had chosen 2, let's say, majority white people, immigrant countries or not.
So that was one of the reasons why we chose these 2 countries. So they have white immigrants or black immigrants from 2 different continents. And our expectation was clearly that the Nigerians would be seen more negatively than the Bulgarians because they are European and white and not black and African. But we didn't find that difference. So they seem very similar. So we don't know why. So that was a surprise to us. Our ad hoc explanation would be that Nigerians are culturally more distant from Great Britain, but at the same time have been more traditional, have been in Britain for a longer time than Bulgarians. Bulgarians is a more recent immigration group, so people may be just more used to Nigerians than to Bulgarians, and so that somehow makes up for the culture difference, that then on average the attitudes are similar, because Bulgarians are similar culturally speaking, but more recent. So that's just the ad hoc explanation we have. We clearly need more research on that. And so we clearly wanted to take groups that do play a role in Great Britain, that have been immigration groups in Great Britain for some time. And we, for example, clearly I'm often asked, why not ask about immigrants from Syria? So when we started the survey in 2015, that the so-called migration crisis just started to become important. So that was not yet an important category at that time. And I think it was also good to exclude them because too many connotations would be made with terrorism and things like that. So that's why we didn't include this group. Gender, I think, so we had to start somewhere. We couldn't include all the categories we wanted to include, but gender clearly plays a role. I would expect a big impact or effect of gender in this whole story. We know that from other research. I mean, on the one hand, women are more tolerant with immigrants, and that's what we know from other research. But when it comes to the particular group of Muslim immigrants and the debates we have about, gender rights and the headscarf, and so attitudes might be not so more positive among women than among men. So, well, we don't know. We haven't included that, but I think I would expect some interesting patterns, some clear differences between female and male respondents. Yeah.
Yeah, we have time for more questions. If there are none, then maybe let me ask the last one of today. What was the reaction to your research when you showed, for example, to policymakers or to audiences? Because Islamophobia is so used in public debate as kind of or it has been, I think it has been weaponized, also it is often weaponized in public debate from both sides maybe, or fears for Islam are also weaponized, of course, in the political debate. So how do you assess the potential for moving towards a more differentiated view? Did you see positive reactions in this regard?
So to be honest, I haven't spoken that much to policymakers or people outside of academia. So I've done this presentation quite a lot in the past, but always most often in an academic context. And this was always very well received, or people found it very interesting. But when it comes to the policy implications, policy aspects, I would say what matters here, or could have an impact, or is that, well, that's the main finding of our study, is that depending on how you describe immigrants, people have very different perception of them and react differently. And it clearly matters. They have not only this one category of Muslim immigrants in their mind, or they might have a specific understanding of Muslim immigrants, but if you tell them, well, there's also different groups and they are more or less religious from different countries, etc., people do actually change their attitudes. And so it seems that that the way we talk about immigrants, about Muslim immigrants or immigrants in general, clearly matters. And we know that, not for this particular group, but we know that from other research, depending on how politicians, so there's other experiments that shows that the way politicians express their opinion on immigration and immigration policies has an effect on how people react in these survey experiments, that they would react differently if you show them a politician who has very negative or very positive attitudes towards immigration policy, or is for more or less restrictive policies. People do actually react to these statements. And that kind of research also has a lot of limitations, but we see that actually people do change their opinions and react differently. And I would expect something, or we do see this here as well, that opinions get more or less negative or positive depending on how you describe them. So I think the way politicians, we talk about immigration in public has an effect on how people think about these issues. So I think that may be one important, or could have an important implication.
As you know, in Germany, we are often talking about the Bringschuld of integration, which means kind of the burden or the debt of integration that has to be brought by the immigrants. I'm always waiting for smart politician reframing this in a more productive way. But okay, thank you, Mark, for answering all our questions. Thank you all for asking them and for coming here today. We hope you enjoyed what we showed you today, what we talked about, and we will be glad to see you the next time again here. Thanks.
Thank you very much.